On a cold night in 1991, a woman was brutally murdered in her own home in Alabama. Decades later, the man responsible faced execution using a controversial new method, nitrogen hypoxia. This isn't just a case of crime and punishment. It's a story of legal battles, moral dilemmas, and the future of capital punishment in America. Was justice truly served, or was this another example of a flawed system at work?
The state of Alabama has executed a Detroit man convicted of murder in both Michigan and Alabama. 52-year-old Demetrius Frazier was put to death using nitrogen gas.
Now his mother is asking Governor Gretchen Whitmer to work with Alabama's governor to stay the execution. CBS News Detroit's Al Meyer spoke with those advocates and the man's family and joins us now from outside the Michigan Capitol.
November 27th, 1991. Pauline Brown, a 40-year-old mother, was asleep in her Birmingham apartment when Demetrius Frazier broke in. Initially, he was after money, stealing only $10 from her home. But what happened next turned a simple burglary into a horrific crime. Frazier sexually assaulted Pauline at gunpoint as she begged for her life. Her final words, "Please don't kill me." But Frazier was unfazed. Annoyed by her pleas, he shot her in the head, left the apartment, then came back to steal more items and even ate 2 bananas before leaving. Cold, calculated, and remorseless. This act would ultimately send him to death row.
Mandatory life sentence for murder, rape, robbery, and weapons offenses in Michigan, where he had separately been convicted of a 1991 murder and sentenced to death.
For over 30 years, Demetrius Frazier sat on death row, fighting appeal after appeal. His legal team argued that he should never have been extradited from Michigan, where he was already serving life for another murder.
Frazier's attorneys filed a federal complaint arguing his transfer from Michigan was unlawful, but the case was dismissed.
His mother, Carol Frazier, desperately pleaded for Michigan's governor to intervene. But the clock was ticking.
What more can I do but just ask? Governor Whitmer, please give him that chance.
With each failed legal attempt, his execution date inched closer. And by 2025, there was no more time left.
I love him. I know he made mistakes. He committed to those mistakes.
On February 5th, 2025, Demetrius Frazier made one final phone call to his mother. "Mom, I'll be free from here," he said, but not by release, by death. As his execution window neared, his legal team withdrew their last appeal, knowing that Michigan would not step in. With the execution chamber prepared, Frazier spent his last hours waiting for what was to come. On February 6, 2025, at 6:36 p.m., Demetrius Frazier was executed by nitrogen hypoxia, making him the 4th person in U.S. history to die by this method.
Will die by nitrogen hypoxia. February 6th, Frazier was convicted of robbing, assaulting, and murdering Pauline Brown back in 1991. Nitrogen executions, while legal in other states.
His final meal? A cheeseburger and fries. His last words? "Detroit strong. I love everybody on death row. Let's go."
During his last words, officials said Frazier apologized to the families of the victims. Reporters in the room say he ended by saying, "Detroit strong."
As the gas was released, he waved his hands, then began gasping for air. Witnesses described sporadic convulsions before he fell still.
He was kind of swirling his wrist. That didn't last very long, so we think that was an indication when he lost consciousness.
Since nitrogen hypoxia was introduced, debates over its humanity have intensified. While Alabama claims it's painless, witnesses described visible suffering.
Attorneys also argued this method of execution does not work as quickly as the state promised. Officials say it took Frazier about 8 minutes to die.
Meanwhile, Pauline Brown's family expressed relief that justice was finally served. But opponents argue that executions do not bring closure, they only add to the cycle of violence. Among the witnesses was reporter Gladys Bautista, who had seen 2 executions before. She described Frazier's body shaking, his face tensing, and his legs twitching. Some say this was a peaceful death. Others claim it was a slow suffocation. The truth? Somewhere in between. Demetrius Frazier, a cold-blooded killer or a changed man? Execution by nitrogen gas? A humane advancement or a more terrifying form of capital punishment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A shocking crime, a brutal murder, when a teenager's act of cruelty turns into one of the most controversial executions in American history. In 1994, Carey Grayson was just 19 when he and 3 other teens brutally murdered a hitchhiker, Vicky DeBleu. Decades later, Grayson became the 3rd person in the U.S. to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia, a method that's drawing global scrutiny. This is the case that's igniting new debates about justice, trauma, and the future of the death penalty.
Carey Grayson was pronounced dead just after 6:30 last night. Grayson, along with 3 others, were charged with the 1994.
Governor Kay Ivey announced that the execution window for Carey Grayson will open at midnight on November 21st.
Grayson will be put to death for the murder of a woman in Jefferson County in the 90s.
He had started with a ride and ended in horror. Vicky DeBleu was hitchhiking her way home to Louisiana when she met 4 teens near Trussville, Alabama. They offered her a ride. What followed was a nightmare. She was beaten, mutilated, and thrown off a cliff. Grayson was the oldest, 19. The others were 16 and 17. One later bragged about biting an organ. Another gifted a severed finger. All 4 were convicted. But only Grayson, legally an adult at the time, was sentenced to death. This wasn't just a murder, it was a display of depravity that shocked even seasoned prosecutors.
They drove deep into a wooded area and everyone got out. By this point, Vicky realized she was in danger and made a run for it. But the youths caught up to her and began beating her mercilessly.
For 30 years, Grayson sat on Alabama's death row, silent, waiting, forgotten by most. But as his execution neared, lawyers launched last-minute appeals. They challenged the method of nitrogen gas, calling it cruel and experimental. Meanwhile, public support for the death penalty wavered. Even Vicky's daughter, Jody Haley, opposed Grayson's execution. She said, "Revenge shouldn't be justice. I've lived without my mom. I don't want another person to die." But the state moved forward anyway.
Grayson's team says they are filing last-minute appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's unclear what's been decided.
Midnight on November 21st. The window opens. Grayson's final hours begin as the world watches Alabama's 3rd use of nitrogen hypoxia, a method still unproven, still feared. The clock is ticking. Protesters gather. Appeals are denied. Justice or vengeance is about to be carried out. At 6:06 p.m., the curtain rises. By 6:33, Carey Grayson is dead. His final act, flipping off the witnesses and cursing staff. His final meal remains unknown, but his message was loud and vulgar. He gasped for air 14 times over 27 minutes. The family of Vicky DeBleu watched silently. Her daughter Jody later said, "No one should have the right to take a life." Alabama officials insisted the method was humane, but what the witnesses saw said otherwise.
Curtain opened about 6:06. He was pronounced deceased at 6:33.
The backlash was immediate. Outside the Capitol, protesters from death penalty action held signs, chanting for reform. They argued this execution, and the method used, was state-sanctioned torture. Abe Bonowitz called it unnecessary. Even with the public divided, Alabama stands firm. But one thing is clear: the debate over nitrogen hypoxia is just beginning.
This is just another one of those cases, Carey Grayson, where it's unnecessary. He's not hurt anybody in prison.
Witnesses described it as long, slow, and disturbing. Grayson twitched, gasped, and fought his restraints. Officials called it involuntary. But to those watching, it didn't look painless. This was not the clinical death promised. This was a man struggling for air, live, in front of the state.
The first movements he was doing, all that, in our opinion and other staff, that was all show. Just consistent with what he's been doing. Some of his movements, just as we've talked about the other two, you're going to have involuntary body movement in the nitrogen hypoxia executions.
Carey Grayson's life ended with violence, both given and received. His victim's memory lives on through grief, and now debate. Was this justice, or another failure in a broken system? As more states consider nitrogen hypoxia, one question lingers: how we execute says a lot about who we are. In a historic and deeply controversial moment, the state of Alabama became the first to execute a death row inmate using nitrogen gas, a method never before used in the U.S. This execution of Kenneth Eugene Smith has triggered a global debate over human rights, justice, and the future of capital punishment. Convicted of a 1988 murder for hire, Smith was already the subject of a failed execution attempt. What followed was a sequence of legal battles, public protests, and ultimately, an execution many are calling inhumane.
All eyes are on Atmore as Alabama prepares to perform the country's first ever execution using nitrogen gas.
Well, Alabama is now the first state to use nitrogen gas as a form of execution.
Nitrogen hypoxia as a means of execution is no longer an untested method. It is a proven one.
But how did Kenneth Smith land on death row in the first place? The crime shocked a quiet Alabama community and left a family grieving for decades. In 1988, Smith was one of two men hired by a pastor to kill his own wife, Elizabeth Sennett, in a murder-for-hire plot. She was brutally attacked and left for dead in her home in Colbert County. Smith was convicted and sentenced to death, but it would take over 3 decades, a failed execution, and a new experimental method before the sentence would be carried out. Smith is on death row for the 1988 murder for hire of a woman in Colbert County in North Alabama. For 35 years, Smith sat on death row. His execution delayed time and time again. In 2022, a failed lethal injection left him strapped to a gurney for hours, surviving the attempt. The botched execution brought national outrage and a halt to executions in Alabama. Smith's legal team argued that a second attempt would be cruel and unusual. But despite appeals to the highest courts and vocal protests from his family and supporters, the state pushed forward. In the days leading up to the execution, tension and emotion ran high. Supporters gathered while the family of the victim waited for justice they had anticipated for decades. January 25, 2024. The execution date was set. Smith's final meal was steak and eggs. His last words were to his loved ones. Spiritual advisor Reverend Jeff Hood stood by his side in the chamber. Witnesses said Smith struggled violently before succumbing to the nitrogen gas. At 8:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Charles Sennett Jr., the son of the murder victim, said it was a bittersweet moment. Nothing will bring our mom back, but we're glad this day is over.
He struggled against his restraints a little bit, but there's some involuntary movement and some agonal breathing, so that was all expected.
The execution didn't end the controversy. It fueled a firestorm. Human rights organizations condemned it. The United Nations called it possible torture, while Alabama officials claimed the execution was textbook. International bodies and death penalty critics demanded an investigation. Even the White House expressed concern. Yet Alabama's Attorney General urged other states to follow suit.
Meanwhile, the European Union and United Nations also reacted to Smith's execution. In a joint statement, the international group said, quote, "The European Union and the UN Human Rights Office expressed regret Friday over the first execution of a man with nitrogen gas."
Inside the chamber, those present described a harrowing scene. What was promised to be painless looked like prolonged suffering. Reverend Hood said Smith violently writhed with fluid spilling from his mouth. The execution lasted over 20 minutes. Media witnesses described seeing Smith contort and breathe heavily before finally going still. What Alabama called routine, others called inhumane.
Kenneth Smith laid on the gurney and shook for about 2 minutes, shaking and writhing on that gurney. The gurney did move several times there. Following that shaking on the gurney, there were several minutes, about between 5 and 7 minutes, according to media witnesses, of heavy breathing.
Justice is a concept shaped by law, but it's also judged by conscience. Kenneth Smith's execution has reignited a national debate about punishment, pain, and what a society is willing to endure in the name of justice. Was this the future of capital punishment, or a glimpse into something we must never repeat? When justice takes decades and the accused becomes the oldest man ever executed in modern American history, we're left to ask, is justice delayed, justice served? Walter Leroy Moody's story spans states, decades, and lives shattered by violence. In this documentary, we unravel the story of a federal judge killed by mail and a man who evaded justice until he was 83.
Alabama's oldest death row inmate was executed tonight. Convicted package bomber Walter Moody Jr. died by lethal injection.
Moody was also charged with killing a Savannah attorney, Robert Robinson. Tonight, Mary Morrison sits down with members of Robinson's family.
Crime was calculated. It came in the form of a package, a seemingly innocent parcel that tore apart lives. In December 1989, a federal judge, Robert Vance, opened a bomb sent to his home. Days later, a civil rights attorney, Robbie Robinson, was killed in a similar attack. The bombs bore the same signature: precision, hate, and vengeance. Behind them, Walter Leroy Moody, a man once obsessed with clearing his own criminal record. Instead, he took 2 lives and terrorized a nation. His motive? A vendetta against the judiciary rooted in legal rejection and bitterness.
Moody faces the death chamber for the 1989 murder of Judge Robert Vance. Vance was killed at his Mountain Brook home when he opened up a package that contained a pipe bomb.
Moody never confessed. He maintained his innocence for nearly 30 years. His legal team filed appeal after appeal, even pleading with the U.S. Supreme Court just days before his execution. At 83, he was nearly blind, physically frail, and still defiant. For the families, closure remained elusive. For the courts, the question loomed: is executing the elderly an act of justice or cruelty? As the date neared, anxiety built, not just for the families, but across the nation. It wasn't just another execution, it was a symbol, a culmination of years of grief, justice, and debate. April 19, 2018. Holman Correctional Facility prepared for a chapter to close. Moody was served his final meal. There are no records of any last words. At 6 p.m., the state began preparations. Just after 9:30 p.m., he was pronounced dead. For the son of Judge Vance, the execution brought no joy, just the weight of memory. For Robbie Robinson's family, it was bittersweet. They had waited decades, and now the man who took so much was finally gone. Walter Leroy Moody was executed just after 9:30 tonight, convicted of murdering federal judge Robert Vance. Moody's execution reignited conversations nationwide. Should age spare the guilty? Should death row be a place for retribution or rehabilitation? Civil rights advocates questioned whether execution at such an old age delivered justice, or simply satisfied a system long overdue.
America's death row is graying. This is the question being asked. They want to know whether it's unconstitutional or even cruel to execute the elderly.
Family members of the victims didn't all attend. Some chose peace over participation. Judge Vance's son, for example, stayed home. "I'll just go about my normal day," he said. But normal never really returned. And for those who did witness the moment Moody's life ended, the memories were just as heavy as the crimes themselves.
I won't be attending the execution, and I'll just try to go about my normal day.
Walter Leroy Moody died in a prison hospital bed, but the damage he inflicted was timeless. This wasn't just about bombs. It was about broken families, decades of grief, and a nation wrestling with the meaning of justice. His execution marked an end, not closure, because in stories like these, the echoes of violence carry far beyond the courtroom. In Alabama's history of capital punishment, no name lingers longer than Thomas Whisenhant. A confessed serial killer, his crimes haunted Mobile County for decades. But what makes his story chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the agonizing weight. Over 32 years on death row. For the families of his victims, justice didn't just take time, it froze.
1970s.
The man convicted of the murder, Thomas Whisenhant, is still on death row.
Confessed to the brutal murders of Lenora Hyatt back in April and Cheryl Patton just this past weekend.
In 1976, Cheryl Patton was days away from quitting her job at a convenience store in Mobile. She feared for her safety. 2 other clerks had already vanished. On a rainy night, Patton disappeared. Her body was found mutilated. Thomas Whisenhant later confessed not only to her murder, but to others. His violence had a pattern. Women, isolated, vulnerable. A serial killer hidden behind the mask of a father and husband.
Already confessed to the brutal murders of Lenora Hyatt back in April and Cheryl Patton just this past.
But after his conviction, Whisenhant began what would become the longest death row stay in Alabama. His initial conviction was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct, but he was reconvicted in 1981. Legal motions and appeals stretched into decades. For the victims' families, each year without closure was a reopened wound.
First conviction was overturned because of comments by then District Attorney Charles Graddick. Whisenhant was convicted again in 1981.
In 2010, after 32 years, the wait was almost over. The state of Alabama announced an execution date. The air grew heavy, not with relief, but with the weight of everything left unsaid. On May 27, 2010, Thomas Whisenhant was led to the execution chamber. For his last meal, he chose fried chicken, fries, cheese, pudding, comfort foods of his youth. When asked for his final words, he whispered, "I'm sorry for what I've done. I know I've hurt so many people." For the victims' families, it was a moment both cathartic and cruel. The man they had waited decades to face was leaving quietly. The execution stirred deep questions in Alabama. Some saw justice fulfilled, others saw a system too slow to act. 32 years on death row had cost the state and families far more than time. It had tested faith in justice itself. In the silence after his final breath, the debate was only beginning.
For this family, it's like a nightmare that's lasted more than 30 years.
Those inside the chamber described an eerie calm. Whisenhant showed no struggle, no tears, just a man, aged and diminished, facing what he had long evaded. Reporters, guards, officials all watched as a chapter in Alabama's darkest history finally closed. Quiet, controlled, clinical. Thomas Whisenhant's story is more than the account of a killer. It's a reflection of a justice system locked in time. For his victims, time stopped in the 1970s. For his family, it was frozen on death row. And for the public, it's a reminder that even when justice comes, it may come too late to heal.